you rather than that. There we go. Here it is. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about Centrisk, which is something that I've been working on, which is a sort of a more automated way of building upstream supply chain resilience. So you'll hear me mention that a few times, and I will show you a little demo later on. But most of the conversation is going to be focused on the underpinning principles and challenges relating to supply chain risk, and crucially how we might go about managing them. And really, at the heart of this are two core messages. One, that we really need to start getting serious about better understanding upstream supply chain vulnerabilities. And that means getting a much stronger building a much stronger understanding of the supply chain that we rely upon, not just the direct suppliers that we pay invoices to and receive goods and services from, but the suppliers that supply them and the suppliers that supply them. So that's the first key message I want to leave you with today. And the second one is that to actually manage supply chain risk effectively, we can't just leave it to one or two teams to do on their own. Just like resilience more broadly, it's everybody's job, and it takes an enterprise-wide effort to properly both understand the risk and manage it. And sadly, I see this all the time. Sort of supply chain related risks end up sitting in one very small part of the organization, and then you have the resilience teams running the continuity planning and the testing and exercising and so forth. Then you might have legal teams looking at contract risk and compliance to sanctions and other bits, and they just don't talk to each other. So we need to get better at kind of bridging the gaps between some of those different functions. So the context for this, I've already sort of hinted at this. I mean, we pick up the newspaper on any given day, or tune into the news. I'm giving my age away a little bit here. Tune into the news on any given day, and you will see stories about supply chain disruptions, whether that be Boeing's quality issues or fires in Los Angeles impacting on the supplies of critical goods. Or it might be in terms of impact to utilities, energy distribution, telecommunications, and so forth. Yet not a day goes past where we don't see something impacting on supply chains and on suppliers that are often in quite geopolitically unstable parts of the world. So even if, as an organization, or the organizations that you would advise don't necessarily think they've got any direct exposures to things like the Red Sea shipping crisis, or suppliers in Turkey, or they don't think they use that much lithium in their supply chain, the reality is somewhere in the upstream supply chain you will be impacted. So these big global events really do have quite meaningful impacts upon organizations much further downstream. And the issue is a lot of those impacts are totally invisible to organizations until they manifest as disruptions. Because if you haven't appreciated you've got this exposure to, say, Turkey, then when that earthquake occurs and your supply chain is impacted, yes, there'll be a bit of a lag time between the impact and the disruption, or the event and the impact on your organization, but it's still coming. So spending some time up front, better understanding what those vulnerabilities are, and putting in place resilience measures to reduce the impact or completely avoid the impact entirely is really quite important. And this is a great sort of chart. Sort of this comes from all the insurance data that we sit on in Marsh. It just shows how some of these risks are just getting bigger and bigger. So the blue line across the bottom are non-climate related events, losses in the insurance market, usually technological or accidents, that kind of thing. And then the darker blue line with the red trend line sort of showing the obvious kind of growth over time are climate related events. So there is a growing number of disruptions caused by natural disasters, And those natural disasters, when you look at the figures in terms of the costs that they have on businesses, are getting bigger and bigger. The catastrophic losses that some of the insurance industry players report are getting worse. And I think layered on top of that are some structural weaknesses in the way that a lot of organizations currently manage supply chain risk. And I've hinted towards some of this already in my opening remarks. Typically, and I think this is the same for a lot of enterprise risk management, done poorly in a lot of organizations, a lot of our focus tends to be rearward looking rather than thinking about the future and thinking about the horizon, the risks that are just over the horizon that we need to start planning for. So we've got a bunch of risk metrics that tend to be measuring what's happened in the past rather than looking out the front windscreen for the thing that's about to hit the organization. And that's again another reason why, in my view, some of the resilience thinking that this group will be very familiar with is so important, because they are one of a small number of individuals within large complex organizations that are having that longer term, or taking that longer term view. We also tend to focus too much on the known. So we're worrying about that the supplier that we can see rather than the supplier that's hidden behind that supplier, that is possibly more critical because it represents a single point of failure, or you're sourcing something further upstream in the supply chain that is exposed to highly significant geopolitical risks, and I'll show you some of those a little bit later on. And that kind of all means that drives organizations to spend less time focusing on resilience, thinking about how to manage some of these issues. Yes, we spend a lot of time dealing with individual risks, but how much time do organizations really start to think about the network of risks that sit within the supply chain, and build resilience to that? So there's both the context being two parts to the context. One being the risk environment is a lot more volatile than it certainly has been in the past. And then there are structural weaknesses in the way that we deliver risk management and deliver resilience in the context of supply chains that are concerning. So in order to get to where we need to get to, we need to deal with some of these challenges. So as I mentioned already, a lot of organizations just simply don't know enough about what their upstream supply chain actually looks like. I mean, if you don't know who your direct suppliers are, the people paying invoices to and receiving the goods and services from, I mean, you've probably got much bigger governance issues, but most people know that, but they don't know who sits behind them. And that lack of visibility bleeds into the second box on this slide, in that it puts organizations in a much more reactive kind of posture to disruption events, because they can't see the risk, and if they can't see it, they only know about the issue when it hits them, rather than being able to forecast the potential for a disruption, months or even years out, and starting to put resilience measures in place to deal with it. We're also getting increasing pressure from regulators, particularly across Europe and to a certain degree in the UK as well. And investors are asking more questions about supply chain resilience, and customers clearly are demanding more from the companies that they're choosing to do business with. It's the regulators, though, that I'm particularly interested in, because that tends to drive, in my experience, and you may have other views, but tends to drive more immediate and concerted action from organisations. If the board and the exec team are on the hook to a regulator, they're likely to take more interest in implementing a solution to the challenge. And in the context of supply chain, there's quite a smorgasbord of sort of supply chain related regulations that are of relevance. Some of which have been around for a very long time, like fraud, bribery, and corruption legislation across most of the Western world. They have versions of that kind of legislation to prevent fraud and or terrorism financing within the supply chain. Um, but then more recently, over the last 5 years or so, we've seen an increasing amount of sustainability related regulation, particularly coming out of the European Union, focusing on, for example, deforestation risk within the supply chain, so EU deforestation regulations, on carbon border adjustment mechanisms to kind of effectively reduce the chance that the offshore carbon intensive industries, and all of that relies, managing that increasing burden of regulation relies upon, and again back to that first box of knowing the supply chain. So using one example, EU deforestation regulations, how can you be sure that you haven't got within your supply chain a supplier that isn't contributing to deforestation if you don't know what the supply chain looks like? You'd be making it up. So you have to do that upstream mapping in order to deliver compliance. And then the final point, I mean, I have to say this, coming from an insurance brokerage, yeah, the insurance industry has generally been pretty poor in providing coverage for supply chain related risks. They're either non-existent or very limited in terms of their scope and coverage. And when you look at the reasons why, it's because they have the same challenges. The insurance companies have the same challenges that corporate companies do as well. They can't see the risk, and if they can't see it, they can't measure it, and if they can't measure it, they can't price it. So that's why they're not willing to take risk that they don't understand. So you sort of understand why there isn't that much supply chain resilience, supply chain insurance coverage. I mean, that is changing, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But clearly, solving these challenges is becoming a business priority. This was a piece of research that Oliver Wyman did in the summer this year, and it's the bottom one that I think is quite hugely impactful. Yeah, almost all companies are willing to invest some level of their revenue in or profit into building supply chain resilience. It's almost to me like, and it'd be interesting to get your perspectives on this, because you talk to a lot of other organizations globally as well. It's almost like supply chain is where cyber resilience was at about 5, 10 years ago, when it was creeping up the board agenda and then became the number one item. It's still there, but it's not necessarily discussed in as much detail as perhaps it should be. Supply chain, I think, is now at that level, and companies starting to really wake up to the fact that they've got huge vulnerabilities that are just not being properly managed. Now, Centris, that little tool that I mentioned, we've mapped more than 2 million locations. I think it's close to 3 million now, globally across 15 different sectors. And there's some really interesting stats that are coming out of that data. 65% of organizations have at least one highly critical bottleneck, a single point of failure, hidden within the supply chain that they didn't know about. And looking at all of our claims data on the insurance side, they're the things that kill businesses. They're the things that, a disruption at a small manufacturing plant in the East Midlands that is super critical for a major aerospace manufacturer, as an example, is unknown until the fire takes the factory out. And then exposure to China is an interesting one. And everyone knows that China is an absolute powerhouse in terms of manufacturing. But did you know that for every tier one supplier, you will have at least 150 upstream suppliers just in China alone? So if you're an automotive OEM, you've probably got between 50 and 75,000 tier one suppliers. I mean, you can do the maths based on that. It's a vast exposure. That 82% surprised me. So have at least one critical supplier in an active conflict zone. That's mainly driven by Israel, and to a degree Russia and Ukraine, but certainly Israel, particularly in higher tech sectors, so aerospace, defense, electronics. Israel is quite strong in those sectors, but normally not tier one suppliers, usually sort of smaller entities within the supply chain. And currently, I checked this recently, a fifth of all organizations have got of their supply chain is operating under a drought warning. So when you're thinking about like data centers, for example, which is going to have to be a huge investment in that in that piece section of infrastructure in the future, hugely reliant on water. Well, how are you going to do that when a fifth of the supply chain is already under strain? In the UK, I think it was I haven't got it on the screen here, but about 13% of suppliers are at very high risk of flooding. And in the US, you swap that for a similar number, but you swap that for earthquake, mainly because of West Coast exposures. Does any of that surprise you before I kind of move on? So I've been talking for a while now, and I'm conscious that nobody has said anything. So happy to get some interaction.
I'll kick it off. Oh, sorry, someone else is going to talk.
No, I was going to say there's a couple of comments in the chat, but you go for it, Joe. Go for it.
Yeah, ignore my discussion. That's a discussion for another time, because obviously I didn't introduce that. I've done lots of insurance and financial services stuff and regulations. 82% is really high, and I also thought conflict zone. I just went down, for those of you who know me, I went down the old rabbit hole of define conflict zone, and is that a moving thing? Does it have to be a conflict zone for a certain amount of time, or is it just a snapshot? It's got to be a snapshot, I guess.
It's a snapshot, yeah. All of these are snapshots because supply chains change quite frequently. But yeah, and the way that we calculated that, we were looking. We have geopolitical risk scoring that basically says you've got a war. You kind of know when the threshold is.
Yes.
So and it's all the places you'd expect. Certain Ethiopia, Israel, Ukraine, Thailand, Cambodia, those kind of the places you see in the news.
That's so high. That's the one that I think that's one that surprised me the most.
I think this isn't 82% of your supply chain, because that would really scare the pants off me. It's that you've got at least one entity in the supply chain. And when you think about, like, going back to that example of the OEM with 70,000 tier one suppliers, they'll have millions in their upstream supply chain. So there will always be somewhere hidden within the supply chain where there is a big risk. I mean, just having done 800 of these kind of client level analyses now, I have not found one company that doesn't have at least one sanctioned entity within their supply chain, just as an example, because of the pervasive nature of supply chains.
Yeah, that's a whole other subject, isn't it? The risks around sanctions and the writing stuff, because I was working somewhere that had discovered they had sanctioned entities that they didn't realize they had.
I'm going to come back to this. Sorry, Beverly, you want to come in?
Yeah, James, so this week I had the kind of newsletter from the World Economic Forum about, it says the future home. I put it in the chat. Where is your future home at danger? But I've been using that with my students, going, so where are the organisations that you work with in the future for, the heat, the climate change, the as you said, flooding, but, a lot of our mega cities where perhaps some of this is coming from. And you start to look at the list and the stats of where the heat's going to come that we couldn't work, and some of the countries we get a lot of our supplies from are in that, and it's that future horizon scan. Well, it's here really rather than horizon scanning, but I just wonder how much of that you see in your work.
Yeah, we do. A really good point. Certainly, like heat stress, water stress tends to be high up the agenda in industries that are use a lot of water, like data centers or bottling Coca-Cola or some companies like that. Less of a priority for others, but it should be. It should definitely be a priority. One of the things we have done with some of the analytics that underpins this is sort of, then once you understand that broader upstream network, then you overlay a whole bunch of climate scenarios on top of it. So did a project with a pasta sauce company in Italy, and they found where their tomatoes were coming from with this kind of mapping process, and then overlaid on top of that and a crop yield model basically that said, so those farms in Spain and Italy in 20 years time are just not the place to be sourcing tomatoes from, because it can be too expensive or they just won't be able to grow. But because it's a global model, you can start looking at other locations where you could source it from. So that company is actually starting to invest in agriculture in China in order to give them a hedge for a risk that they don't expect to actually impact for another 10 years. But they're starting to think like that. I'm going to come back to a little demo in the end if we've got time. But when we're talking to companies around building supply chain resilience, it absolutely starts with that upstream visibility using things like Centrisk. And once you've understood that broader network overlaid on top of that a bunch of risk assessments, you can start to make some more meaningful decisions about how to proactively respond to disruptions. And what all that data allows businesses to do is start to challenge that balance between cost and resilience, efficiency and resilience. Yeah, in my experience, particularly in manufacturing, we have over-indexed on lean production and cost cutting, because every bit of cost usually is resilience. It could be argued that it's the other side of the coin. And without the sufficient data, I think a lot of those cost-cutting exercises have been done delivered blindly. And now that the risk environment's much more volatile than it was, you've got this kind of perfect storm of a highly fragile supply chain, and then a whole new load of new risks, like the climate ones that Beverly was talking about, that further destabilize those supply chains. And when we're starting to think about kind of actually what do we do to manage some of these issues, this isn't about just waiting for a disruption to occur and putting in place or responding with business continuity. Now, clearly that is super important. There will always be a need for those kind of recovery plans, but you don't want to wait to feel the pain. You want to start to think about what kind of levers that we can pull to affect resilience. And there's a few examples on the screen here. Challenge though is that everyone's resilience will be different. The focus that you place upon the amount of inventory that you might hold, the amount of redundancy you might have within the supply chain with multiple suppliers will be different, and will be very unique to the individual risk context that your organization is operating in and the industry. So it's all very well, for example, I know we've got a colleague from IT procurement. It's great to talk about holding extra stock of certain bits of technology in order to hedge against a potential disruption. Well, great, but what if that technology becomes obsolete in the time that you're holding it? You've got huge amounts of capital locked up in holding kit that in 6 months' time nobody wants. Same for sort of supermarkets. Clearly, you can't keep cheese on the shelf for months at a time. You can't stockpile it. Although as a child, when they talked about sort of the milk lakes in Europe and the butter mountain, I sort of had this image of this sort of warehouse with butter, which comes back to my mind. But the point is, everyone's resilience levers are gonna be different, and what a defense company does versus what Tesco does will follow similar principles, but the actual kind of levers that you ultimately pull will be different. And once you kind of understand the criticality of the upstream supply chain, the vulnerability of the supply chain, and some of the risks that you might be exposed to, you can then start to think a little bit more actively about the right kind of or tailoring the resilience treatment that you might apply to certain types of supply. This comes from some work that I did with a big energy major in the Middle East, and the components in the top right sort of side of the chart was super critical, and effectively production would stop without some of these things. So because they are so critical and because they're quite high risk because of the supply chain that underpins them, you want to be storing more of them. Some inventory on site, maybe local production. Either bring your suppliers closer to you to produce them, or do what Emirates is doing with the A380 and actually start manufacturing with Airbus some of the components themselves, because nobody else buys A380s anymore, so they have to do it. They have to do it themselves. So they've kind of brought that in house. That kind of approach, or this sort of approach, allows you to, in my experience, in the same way that you would by doing a business impact analysis process in business continuity, to focus on the crown jewels, the things that really matter, the things that, if they weren't available, would cause operations to stop. And the crucial thing to remember with this sort of approach is that we're not talking about the most important supplies or the most important components being the things that you spend the most money on. That's not the relationship between how much you spend and how critical it is, and isn't always that clear. I worked with a big food and beverage company not that long ago where they buy billions of dollars worth of sugar, of packaging, of flour, some of the sort of the raw materials that go into their products. But it wasn't those components that were key. It was the fish oil that's used in all of their product lines, but a tiny amount, tiny amount of money is spent on that on an annual basis. But if they didn't have it, production lines everywhere would stop. So it's sort of sometimes when you over focus on how much you're spending on a supplier versus how critical it is from an operational point of view, you get slightly skewed results. But while I'm here, let me just show you some of that centrisk sort of thinking. I flashed it up earlier on. This is where all that data that I showed you earlier today comes from. This is actually a real live organization, but I've taken all the data relating to the company out, so hopefully you won't work out who it is. But it's an automotive company. It's a Western automotive company, and what we do with them with our clients is, if I just filter by tier 0 and tier 1. So what you're seeing on the screen here is a small subset of their supply chain, 236, tier 0 being their own sites. There's one here, look down in Southeast Asia, and tier 1 being their direct suppliers. So that's where most people stop in terms of their understanding of the upstream supply chain. And if you wanted to get any more detail further up, you'd have to go and phone your tier 1 suppliers, which takes too long and often comes back with poor results. What we do is look into trade data. Basically, it's shipping manifest data, it's customs clearance information, shipping information, logistics firms data, and in that data you can see the physical exchange of goods, and you can filter for the things that matter to the production of seats or the gearbox or whatever it is. So I can see, if I know who they're getting the engine components from a tier 1, I can look into their supply chain and look for the aluminium and look for the steel, look for the plastics and everything else that sort of flows into it. So that's tier 2, and then tier 3 further up the supply chain. And what you will see as I built that up is more of the supply chain illuminating in Southeast Asia. And if I scroll into places like Vietnam, you get these concentration risks building up in places like Hanoi. And this is a great example. Every manufacturing firm has something similar to this. So in the Trump administration, the first time around, when he put sanctions against China, then a lot of manufacturing companies moved some of their operations out of China into neighboring countries to avoid some of the tariffs, a China +1 strategy. And this is the result. You end up with clusters of suppliers that are all exposed to very similar natural hazard and geopolitical related risk. It's what we saw in Thailand in 2011 when we had the floods there and the automotive industry had an issue. So every single one of these sites, we map them, we geolocate them, and then we perform a whole bunch of risk assessments to understand their exposure to different types of natural hazard risk, geopolitical risk, and then some structural risks. And then from an insurance point of view, you can start to think about what the impact of certain risks might be. So a 1 in 200 year flood event, 28 days of downtime is actually relatively minor risk in this case. We've got some others in here that are a lot more significant. The other thing that allows you to do is, because we're visualizing the physical exchange of goods, you can see the flow of goods across the globe. This one doesn't go into the US, but once you know the borders that it's crossing, we can also do work on the kind of routes that it's taking. You can start to calculate tariff costs and the risks attached to tariff impacts. So this approach to get from very limited understanding of your supply chain, tier ones, to a much more comprehensive view. Admittedly, this is only a very small subset of a company's supply chain. Can be done in a matter of hours rather than years, which is what it takes to run an upstream supply chain mapping process when you're doing it manually. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to just pause there for a second and let people ask questions. And I've not been keeping an eye on the chat, so if you've been asking questions in there, then please please just raise your hand.
So there are, I think all the questions have been discussed. I mean, this is all really fascinating. Anyone else for any questions before I'm just, my brain is a little bit befuddled by everything you shared there, James. And
just wanted to say, very, very interesting, James, because you made a reference about sort of IT stock and procurement. It's a very, very complex, delicate scenario. It's not just about managing your stock, but the risk come from a variety of places. It's not, you know, the stock is really just probably a very small percentage. Right now, the biggest risk probably in the disruptions that comes is from potential hackers, certainly from the technology side, the attacks to the softwares. As a university, we get many different attacks pretty much every night in the hundreds. So I would say probably managing those risks in the supply chain, it's how do we protect ourselves? How do we leverage, you know, our position and our strength with, and how do we keep on top of those threats, really? But essential cybersecurity is possibly far more complex than managing stock. Way more complex.
Yeah, I think you're right, Monica. I picked on one very small part of some of your supply chain concerns. I absolutely appreciate what you're saying. The other angle that we see a lot of conversation, particularly in universities and in defense businesses, is the exposure in the supply chain to China. We've run analyses, particularly in defense, to look at ownership structures of companies in China and their supply chain, and we found some absolute horrors. Companies that have funding directly from bits of defense infrastructure in China that are sitting in NATO-backed OEMs, or controlled by individuals that are known to be stealing, espionage effectively, all the way through to forced labor, obviously, in China, which is a major issue.
Yeah. But also the war, I know you touched on that, another very big area. We had a supplier and we just signed them up. We did a full tender, and it was just before the war in Ukraine, and nobody could foresee that happening. And we'd done all our due diligence, the tender, and we signed up the supplier in January, and in February, I mean, their headquarters were in Kiev. Yeah. And it caused a massive disruption for us, but also things were not being delivered. The services were massive, but what can you do? I mean, you really felt that there's a human aspect, that these people were being bombed, so they couldn't go to work to their offices. So that was a real shocker. And yeah, we had to work with them and take an element of being patient until they could relocate some of their essential businesses, essential aspects, and so on.
Yeah,
thank you.
we saw something similar with some of our clients. And issue, there's like a couple of phases of activity. You had like there was an immediate disruption as people were like making sense of what was happening. And then some of my clients actually saw huge increases in productivity coming out of Ukraine as people kind of like, it was almost like the blitzing sort of like spirit, like people just sort of focusing on work. And then I had companies even going as far as setting up recruitment programs in Romania to pick up highly experienced coders coming out of Ukraine. It's like so they saw it as an opportunity more than anything. Slightly perverse, but yeah.
Fascinating. I think there's a lot that we can keep going about it. I'm conscious that we are slightly over time, so I don't know if anyone else has any key questions for James.
Well, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you, Helen, for setting it up.
No problem. Really appreciate you coming, and I think given everyone a lot to think about. As I put in the chat, your comment about, I do think that cyber has overtaken supply chain. I think 5-10 years ago it was the thing that everyone was worried about, and now cyber is absolutely it. And I think it's trying to make sure we don't lose track of the other elements that we need to be thinking about as organisations.
Exactly.
So really good reminders about that. Thank you very much.
Thank
as
you.
always, we'll share the information and thank you, everybody. As I put in the chat, we are taking a break in January, so there won't be an RBCR session in January, but please, if you're interested, sign up and join us when we restart in February.
Thank you, James. Thanks, Helen.
Have a good holiday, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Everybody. Thanks.